Some lands are bought with money, others are paid for with generations of pain. When Clara Sterling arrives at Gideon Vance's ranch, she believes she is handling a simple land deal. But buried beneath the soil of Bitterroot Creek is a secret tied to her own bloodline, a stolen spring, a moved boundary stone, and a father who died believing he had failed. Now, between a feared cowboy and a determined widow, the truth must rise from the dust, and someone must decide whether justice means revenge or healing. Subscribe for more Western tales filled with heart, hope, and redemption.
The Texas sun in 1878 doesn't just shine, it judges. It felt like a heavy hand on my shoulders as I pulled the reins on a rented bay, the dust of Bitterroot Creek coating my throat like ground glass. My name is Clara Sterling. I am 34 years old. I am a widow, and I am a woman who trusts in paper more than people. In my saddlebag sat a leather-bound ledger. It held 47 pages of legal descriptions, title searches, and a ceiling price of $4,200. To my firm in Denver, this was a transaction. To me, it was a way to stay busy enough to forget the silence of my own house. I stopped at the town S-only hotel to wash the grit from my face. The clerk, a man with skin like parchment, watched me with eyes full of pity. "You heading out to the Vance place?" he asked. He didn't even try to hide his eavesdropping. "I am," I said. "I have business with Gideon Vance." The man leaned over the counter. He lowered his voice. "He's a monster, ma'am. Plain and simple. A man that size with that much blood on his past? He ain't right. You'd be safer sleeping in a den of rattlers." I looked him straight in the eye. I felt the need to say it out loud. "Sir, a monster is usually just a man we haven't taken time to understand. People use labels when they are too lazy to seek the truth. I'm here for a signature, not a campfire story." He scoffed. I walked out. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours. The land changed. It got greener. The air grew heavy, like it was holding its breath before a storm. I saw him before I reached the gate. He wasn't at the house. He was standing by the fence line, looking toward the north. He was huge. 6'5", at least. Shoulders like an ox. He didn't move. He just stood there, a mountain of a man carved out of shadow and denim. But before I reached him, I saw a boy. He was sitting on the top rail of the fence. A small scrap of a thing, maybe 7 years old. He was swinging his legs and eating a wild apple. He didn't look scared. He looked bored. "You the lady from the city?" the boy asked. "I am," I said, slowing my horse. "I'm Clara. Who are you?" "I'm Caleb, but they call Pip," he said. He pointed a sticky finger at the giant man in the distance. "You here to see the monster?" I frowned. "That's a mean word, Caleb." The boy hopped down. He walked over to my horse and patted its nose. "People see a mountain and get scared of the height," Pip said, looking up at me. "I see a man who fixed my boots and gave me an apple." Adults are funny, Clara. They think because someone is big and quiet, they must be hiding a devil. But a heart isn't measured by the size of a man's shadow. It's measured by what his hands do when nobody's watching. I stared at him. A 7-year-old orphan had just given me a better lesson in human rights than my law professors. I nudged the bay forward. Gideon Vance turned as I approached. Up close, he was even more imposing. His face was a map of hard miles. Scars lived in the corners of his eyes. He didn't tip his head. He didn't smile. He just waited. "Mr. Vance," I said, dismounting. My legs were shaky. "I'm M. Clarissa Sterling. I have the papers for the sale of the 400 acres. I reached for my ledger. I wanted to talk numbers. I wanted to talk interest rates and deeds of trust. Gideon spoke for the first time. His voice was deep. It sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "I know who you are," he said. "Then you know why I am here. My firm is prepared to offer." "I don't care about the offer," he interrupted. He stepped closer. The air seemed to get thinner. You want this land? You want to put your name on this soil? That is the goal. Yes. Gideon looked at my hands. They were soft. They were city hands. Then he looked at the horizon. This land is a living thing, Mrs. Sterling. It's not a line on a map. You stay here till one days, he said. Sounded like a decree. You work the fence and you watch the sky. If you are still standing on day 22 and you still want to buy it, I'll sign. That is highly irregular, I stammered. A contract. A contract is just ink, Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave. And the truth is the only way to earn the right to own it. If you won't give this place 3 weeks of your life, you don't deserve a single acre of its history. You have to see a person and a place for what they really are before you can claim them. He turned and walked toward the barn. He didn't look back. I stood there in the dust. The sun was setting. The monster was walking away, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking of my ledger. I was thinking about what it meant to truly see. He has got good apples, Pip whispered from the fence. I looked at the house. I looked at my horse. 3 weeks, I whispered. I suppose I can survive 3 weeks. But as I watched the giant cowboy disappear into the shadows of the barn, had the strange feeling that it wasn't the land I was going to be studying. It was the man. The morning didn't break. It just sort of bled into the sky. A pale, bruised purple over the bitterroot ridges. I was already on my second cup of coffee when I heard the floorboards groan in the guest cabin. She was up. Most city folks don't find their feet until the sun is high enough to burn the dew off the grass. But Clara Sterling wasn't most folks. I seen that the moment she hopped off that bay, she had a look in her eyes, like she was searching for something she'd lost a long time ago, and she wanted to find it. I sat on the porch, my back against the cedar post. My bones ached. They always ached when the air got heavy. 6 months ago, a man named Henderson came out here. He wore a suit that cost more than my barn. He had a gold watch and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I gave him the same deal. 21 days. He didn't make it to day 4. He looked at me, saw the scars on my neck and the way my shadow stretched across the yard, and he saw a beast. He thought I was going to bury him in the north pasture. He left in the middle of the night. He left because he couldn't stand the quiet. Folks think the quiet is empty. It ain't. The quiet is where the truth lives, and most people are terrified of the truth. Clara stepped out onto the cabin porch. She looked at me. She didn't flinch. Coffee is in the pot, I said. My voice felt like gravel. She walked over. She took a cup. She didn't say good morning. I liked that morning. Is a time for waking up, not for flapping your gums. Henderson didn't stay, I said, looking at the horizon. She took a sip. I'm not Henderson. No, you ain't. He was scared of what people said about me. Looked down at her. Mrs. Sterling, I want you to hear this clear, I said. The world has a habit of building a cage out of a man's reputation. They take one mistake, or one tragedy, and they weave it into a net until you can move. But a man's right to a second chance is a holy thing. It is the foundation of a just society. If we don't allow a person to grow past their worst day, then we aren't living in a civilization. Just living in a graveyard of old sins. You here to buy land, but if you spend your time looking at the monster the town told you about, you'll never see the man standing in front of you, and you surely won't see the truth of this dirt. She looked at me for a long beat. She didn't look away. Most people look at my chin or the floor. She looked at my eyes. I'm not here for the stories, Gideon, she said. I'm here for the truth, even if it hurts to look at. Good, I said. Then just grab a shovel. The south fence line don't care about your feelings. It just needs fixing. Missed the day in the heat. I didn't help her. I watched her. I watched her hands on his blister. I watched her back go stiff. She didn't ask for a break. She didn't complain about the flies. Around noon, Pip showed up. That boy has a way of appearing out of the tall grass like a jackrabbit. He sat on a stump and watched Clara dig. You're doing it wrong, Miss Clara, Pip said. He had an apple in his hand. Always an apple. You gotta use your legs. If you just use your arms, you'll break by sundown. Clara stopped. She wiped sweat from her brow with a dirty sleeve. She looked at the boy. Then she looked at me. I was hammering a staple into a cedar post. He's right, you know, I said, not looking up. There is a deep dignity in manual labor, Clara. It's the great equalizer. In a law office, you can use fancy words to hide a weak argument. But out here, the dirt don't listen to words. It only respects the sweat you give it. When you work with your hands, you learn that every person, no matter their status, is equal before the demands of the earth. A queen and a beggar both get the same blisters. Labor teaches us that we are all made of the same clay, and we all owe the world our effort if we expect to eat. Clara took a breath. She shifted her grip on the shovel. She used her legs. She dug for 3 more hours. By the time the sun started to dip, she was covered in Texas red dirt. Her hair was coming out of its pins. She looked exhausted, but she looked solid. Why do you stay here, Gideon? She asked. We were walking back to the house. The shadows were long. Because the land don't lie, I said. People lie. They lie to themselves. They lie to their neighbors. They tell stories about monsters to make themselves feel like saints. But this land, it tells you exactly what it is every single day. If you don't rain, it stays dry. If you don't plant, it don't grow. It's honest. I stopped at the porch. That is why I demand 21 days, I told her. Because honesty isn't a policy. It's a practice. Know a person's heart in an hour-long meeting. You have to see them when they're tired. You have to see them when they're frustrated. True human connection requires the passage of time. Without time, we only have assumptions. And assumptions are the poison that kills empathy. She nodded, just once. I'll see you at 4, Mr. Vance, she said. She walked to her cabin. Her gait was heavy, but she didn't stumble. I sat back down on my porch. The quiet came back. But for the first time in a long, long while, the quiet didn't feel quite so lonely. My hands were screaming. Every joint in my fingers felt like it had been hammered flat. I sat on the edge of the cot in the guest cabin, looking at the blisters. They were red and angry. Back in Denver, the only injury I ever got was an ink stain or a paper cut. I looked at my ledger sitting on the small wooden table. 47 pages of facts. But as I sat there in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, I realized those pages were empty. The soil composition. They told me the historical rainfall. They told me the market value of the timber. They didn't tell me about the way the air smells right before the cicadas start their evening song. They didn't tell me about the weight of a shovel. I went to the window. Gideon was a silhouette in the yard. He was checking the water troughs. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like a man who knew exactly how much space he occupied in the world. The town called him a monster. I thought about what he said, about the cage of reputation. I'd built a cage for myself, too, the professional widow, the woman who didn't feel, the woman who lived for the law because the law was safe. Morning came with the sound of a crow. I was sore in places I didn't know I had muscles. But I got up, I dressed, I went out. The wind tree is flagging, Gideon said. He was standing by a gnarled, ancient oak near the barn. Its branches were twisted, leaning hard toward the southeast. Flagging? I asked. Look at the leaves, he said. They returning their bellies up. The underside is silver. The tree knows the storm is coming before the sky does. He looked at me. Nature doesn't have a voice, Clara, but it never stops communicating. He said, the problem is that we become too loud to listen. We think because something doesn't speak our language, it has nothing to say. But every living thing has a right to be heard. Respecting life means learning the language of the silent. If you can hear what a tree is telling you, how will you ever hear what a person is saying when they don't have the words to speak their pain? I looked at the tree. I saw the silver leaves. I felt a chill in the air. I spent my whole life reading books, I whispered. Books are good, Gideon said, but books are someone else's thoughts. This tree is its own truth. He handed me a bucket. The north well is acting up. I need to pull the pipe. It's a two-person job. We walked to the north end of the property. The land here was rugged, broken. It felt different from the lush pastures near the house. Pip was there, of course. He was sitting on a rock, whittling a stick. Mr. Gideon says this is part of the land is the memory part, Pip said. I looked at the boy. Memory? Pip nodded. Because it shows the scars of the floods. You can see where the water tore the earth. Chewy noidat comes DMZ hit. I looked at the ground. There were deep gullies, exposed limestone. It looked wounded. My report called this unproductive scrubland. Your company calls this waste, Gideon said, reading my mind. But there is no such thing as a wasted life or a wasted piece of earth. Everything has a purpose in the grand design. This broken ground catches the silt that feeds the lower meadows. It provides a home for the hawks. When we label something as worthless, just because we can find a way to profit from it, we are committing a crime against the inherent value of existence. Every creature and every acre has a right to exist simply because it is here. Its value isn't something you grant it. It's something it already possesses. We worked at the well for 4 hours. It was grueling. We had to pull the heavy lead pipe by hand, inch by inch. Gideon took the weight. I guided the line. I saw the muscles in his back bunch and pull. I saw the sweat soak through his shirt. He was a giant, yes, but he wasn't a monster. He was a man holding up a heavy burden so it wouldn't crush someone else. As we finished, the sky turned a dark, bruised charcoal. The storm was coming. Go to the cabin, Gideon said. I'll check the horses. I can't help, I said, looked at me. His expression softened just for a second. I know you can, but a wise person knows when to take shelter. Go. I ran for the cabin, just as the first fat drops of rain hit the dust. The storm was violent. Thunder shook the floorboards. Lighting turned the room white. I sat by the window, watching the barn. An hour later, there was a knock. I opened the door. Gideon was standing there, soaked to the bone. He held a small, shivering bundle in his arms. It was a lamb. It couldn't have been more than a day old. The mother got spooked, he said. She in the barn, but this one got stuck in the wire. He stepped inside. He sat on the floor and began to dry the lamb with a rough towel. He moved with a tenderness that made my throat ache. His hands, which could snap a fence post, were as gentle as a mother's touch. Strength is not about how much you can destroy, Clara, he said, his voice quiet over the roar of the rain. True strength is about the capacity to be gentle. A man who uses his power to intimidate is a weak man wearing a mask. But a man who uses his power to protect the vulnerable, that is a man who understands his purpose. We are given talents in our size not to dominate others, but to serve them. The measure of a person is found in how they treat those who can do absolutely nothing for them in return. He looked up at me. The lamplight hit the scars on his face. They didn't look like marks of violence anymore. They looked like marks of survival. "You're a good man, Gideon Evans," I said. He didn't answer. He just went back to rubbing the lamb. "They said you were a monster," I whispered to the room. Gideon stopped. He didn't look up. "People say a lot of things to avoid looking in the mirror, Clara. It's easier to point at a monster than it is to admit you're afraid of the dark. But we all have a right to be seen for who we are, not for what others need us to be." I sat on the floor across from him. I didn't reach for my ledger. I didn't think about the $4,200, just watched him save a life. And in the process, I felt something in my own chest start to breathe again. The fog was thick enough to chew. It rolled off the creek in gray ribbons and wrapping around the cedar posts and swallowing the barn hole. I stood by the corral, leaning my weight against the cedar, watching the guest cabin. A light flickered in the window, then the door creaked. Clara Sterling stepped out. She wasn't wearing that fancy city cloak anymore. She had on a wool coat I pulled from the cedar chest, the one that used to belong to my sister before she moved east. It was a bit big on her, but she wore it like she'd been born to it. She didn't walk like she was on a sidewalk anymore. She walked with her weight on the balls of her feet, mindful of the mud, mindful of the life under the soil. She was changing. I could see it in the way she held her head. The stiffness in her neck, that Denver pride, I called it, was melting away. I felt a tug in my chest, a cold, sharp pang. It wasn't pain. It was fear. I'd lived on this ranch for 7 years in near total silence. Silence was my shield. It was the only thing that kept the memories of the courthouse and the hangman's rope from screaming in my ears. I'd grown to like the quiet. I'd convinced myself that I was fine being the monster, because monsters don't need company. But watching her walk toward me through the fog, I realized the house felt different when she wasn't in it. The air felt thinner, and that was a dangerous thing for a man like me to admit. "Morning," she said. Her voice was clear. It cut through the fog like a bell. "Morning," I replied. "Coffee is still hot. Grab a cup. We've got cattle to sort. We spent the first hour in the pens. It says hard work sorting steers. It's about anticipation. It's about being 3 steps ahead of 1,000 pounds of muscle and stubbornness." Clara stood at the gate. I watched her. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't waving her arms like a fool. She was watching the lead steer's eyes. She was waiting for the flinch. When it came, she mutters, "Quiet." The gate swung shut, just as the steer realized he'd been outsmarted. She looked at me, a small, triumphant smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I stopped what I was doing. I leaned against the rail. "You see that, Clara? That steer moved because you gave him a choice, not a threat," I said. I wanted her to hear the weight behind the words. In this world, we re-taught that power is about force. We think if we yell loud enough or push hard enough, we can make the world do our bidding. But a living creature has an inherent right to its own dignity, even when it's being led. When you lead with respect, instead of fear, you create a partnership. When you lead with force, you only create a rebel. Thus, lesson most men in power never learn: the true authority is granted by the one being led, not seized by the one doing the leading. She wiped a smudge of dust from her cheek. "I think people are harder to sort than cattle, Gideon." "Maybe," I said, "but the rules are the same. You have to look at what they afraid of before you can ask them where they going." Around 10, the sun finally burned through the gray. The world turned gold, that S, when Pip showed up. He didn't come through the gate. Never did. He crawled under the bottom rail, his pockets bulging with wild pecans. He sat on the watering trough, swinging his legs. "Mr. Gideon," Pip said, his eyes bright. "Silas says the town is talking. They say you re-keeping a city lady hostage out here." I felt the old iron gate of my heart slam shut. The town. They never missed a chance to paint a target on my back. Clara laughed. It was a rich, warm sound. A hostage? I've never worked so hard for a captor in my life. Pip grinned. He looked at me, then at her. He had that look children get, the one where they see a bridge before the adults even realize there's a river. "Silas says people only tell lies about things they're jealous of," Pip said. He cracked a pecan with a small rock. "Chú ấy nói rằng sự thật là một gánh nặng, mà chỉ những người mạnh mẽ mới có thể gánh vác. Hầu hết mọi người đều thích một lời nói dối thoải mái hơn là một sự thật khó khăn, cháu nghĩ." "Chú Silas nói đúng, chú Gideon à. Mọi con người đều có quyền được biết đến bởi hành động của chính họ, chứ không phải qua những lời thì thầm của những người thậm chí còn không dám nhìn thẳng vào mặt họ. Nếu chúng ta để người khác định nghĩa mình, thì chúng ta đang từ bỏ quyền tự do quý giá nhất của mình, quyền được là chính mình." I looked at that small boy, 7 years old, and he had more wisdom in his little finger than the sheriff had in his whole body. "Silas Thorne is a smart man," I said quietly. "He says you a smart man too," Pip replied. "He just says you've been holding your breath for 7 years and you're starting to turn blue." I turned back to the cattle. I didn't want them to see my face. The day went on. We mended harness. We hauled grain. Every time I looked up, Clara was there. She was becoming a part of the landscape. She was the rhythm of the ranch. The way she moved, the way she listened to the wind tree, it was like a song I'd forgotten I knew. And that's when the twist hit me. I'd spent some months praying for Henderson to leave. I'd have spent some years praying for everyone to leave me alone. I had told myself that if I sold this land to Clara, I'd take the money and go further west. Maybe Oregon, maybe the mountains, somewhere where no one knew the name Gideon Vance. But as I watched her hand a cup of water to Pip, I realized I didn't want to go to Oregon. I didn't want to be alone. For the first time in years, I had something to lose. And that scared me worse than the hangman ever did. Because when you have nothing, you're invincible. You can break what is already shattered. But when you start to care, when you start to look forward to the sound of someone else's boots on the porch, you're wide open, you're vulnerable. I stood in the shadow of the barn, watching them, the giant and the widow and the orphan. "Clara," I called out. My voice was a little rougher than I intended. She looked up. "A man's life is like a stand of timber," I said. I felt the need to tell her, to warn her, and maybe warn myself. You can spend your whole life clearing the brush, trying to make it neat and safe. You can cut down everything that might catch fire or fall over. But if you do that, you end up with a wasteland. A forest needs the messy parts to grow. It needs the dead wood to feed the soil. And a human being has a right to their own mess. We have a right to be complicated. If you only look for the perfect parts of a person, you'll never find the real person. And it's the real person that's worth holding on to. She walked toward me. She stopped just a few feet away. I could smell the dust on her coat and the faint, sweet scent of the pecans Pip had been cracking. "Why are you telling me this, Gideon?" she asked. Her eyes were searching mine. "Because the 21 days are half gone," I said. "And I think you restarting to see things that aren't in your ledger." "I am," she whispered. "Don't let the town take that away from you," I said. "They'll try. They'll tell you I'm dangerous. They'll tell you this land is cursed. But you have a right to your own eyes. Clara, don't ever let someone else tell you what you're seeing." She reached out. She didn't touch me, not yet, but her hand hovered near my arm. I could feel the heat radiating from her. "I see a man who is tired of being a monster," she said. I looked away. The fog was gone now. The sun was high and bright. But inside, I felt a storm brewing, a storm of hope. And hope is a dangerous thing for a man who's already seen the end of the world. "Let us get the horses in," I said, my voice thick. "Pip, go tell the church folks you're staying for supper." The boy let out a holler and ran toward the house. Clara stayed for a moment, looking at me. I realized then that I wasn't just testing her anymore. I was testing myself. Could I let someone in? Could I survive the silence if she actually left on day 22? The house was going to be so quiet when she left. I turned and walked into the barn, the darkness swallowing me up. But for the first time, the darkness didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place where something new might finally have the courage to grow. The cabin was too small for my thoughts. The walls were made of cedar, and at night they smelled of old forest and dried resin. It was a good smell, an honest smell. But tonight, it felt like it was closing in on me. I sat at the small pine table, the kerosene lamp flickering low. Outside, the Texas wind was humming a lonely tune through the eaves. I pulled my leather ledger toward me. I'd been here 12 days. 12 days of blisters, dust, and the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I looked at my notes: soil pH, timber yield, mineral rights. It all looked like gibberish now. It looked like the language of a woman I didn't quite recognize anymore. I reached into the back pocket of the ledger. There was a folded piece of yellow paper, a telegram. It had been tucked into a packet of additional instructions, delivered to me by a passing stagecoach rider 2 days ago. I hadn't looked at it closely until now. It was a misdirected wire. Message meant for my supervisor, Mr. Hargrove, that had accidentally been slipped into my file. I smoothed it out on the table. My breath caught. Ray, Sterling, Cine, Calloway. I title Sir confirms lineage. The Vance will repures a Calloway signature. Torrevillis, the reversionary interest. Send her. She is the only key to unlocking the acreage. Do not disclose the legal necessity. Just get the deed. I stared at the name. Calloway, my maiden name. I hadn't used it in 15 years. I'd buried it when I married Arthur. Buried it along with the memories of a father who lost everything in a land dispute when I was 4 years old. A father who died broken-hearted in a rented room in St. Louis. I wasn't here because I was the best legal mind in Denver. I wasn't here because Hargrove trusted my judgment. I was here because I was a tool, a biological key. They sent me to Bitterroot Creek like a piece of equipment, waiting for me to press my name onto a paper so they could strip Gideon Vance of his home. I felt a cold, hollow space open up in my chest. I didn't sleep. I watched the shadows crawl across the ceiling until the sky turned the color of a wet slate. I dressed in the dark. My fingers were cold as I buttoned my coat. I walked out into the yard. The morning was crisp. The mist was clinging to the grass, making the world look silver. Gideon was by the pump, splashing cold water on his face. He looked up as I approached. He didn't say anything. He never did, not first thing. He just watched me. He saw the way I was holding my shoulders. He saw the yellow paper crumpled in my hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Clara," he said. His voice was low, gentle. "I think I've been living with ghosts my whole life, Gideon. I just didn't know their names." I handed him the telegram. He took it. His large, calloused fingers dwarfed the paper. He read it slowly. I watched his eyes move. I watched his jaw set. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired, like a man who had been carrying a heavy pack for miles and had just been told he had 10 more to go. "Hargrove is a thorough man," Gideon said. He handed the paper back. You knew, I whispered. You knew my name was Calloway. I knew a Sterling was coming. And I knew the Sterling had to be a Calloway. My father, S. Will, was a complicated thing, Clara. He was a man who tried to fix his sins with ink after it was too late to fix them with his heart. I felt a surge of anger, not at Gideon, at the world, at the systems that treated people like pieces on a board. They used me, I said. My voice was trembling. They didn't tell me. They sent me here to play a part in a play I didn't even know was written. They don't care about the land. They don't care about you. And they certainly don't care about me. Gideon stepped closer. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat off him. He looked down at me, his eyes dark and steady. Clara, listen to me, he said. A person is more than a utility. Every human soul has an inherent right to be valued for who they are, for their own thoughts and their own merit, not for what they can provide to someone else's bottom line. When a company or a person treats you like a tool, a means to an end, they are stripping you of your humanity. They are denying your right to be the architect of your own purpose. You are not a key. You are a woman with a mind and a heart, and you have every right to refuse to be used as a footnote in a contract you didn't choose. I looked up at him. The anger was still there, but it was being tempered by something else. A sense of being seen, truly seen. Hargrove thinks he owns my time, I said. He bought your time, maybe, Gideon replied, but he didn't buy your agency. There is a fundamental human right to honesty and transparency in our dealings with one another. When people hide the truth to manipulate your choices, they are stealing your freedom. They are making decisions for you that you ought to be making for yourself. No matter what that paper says, your life belongs to you, not to Hargrove, and not to the ghosts of our fathers. I took a long, shaky breath. The silver mist was starting to lift. What do we do now? I asked. Now, Gideon said, we eat breakfast, and then we work. The north fence is still leaning, and the world doesn't stop turning just because of some lawyers in Denver think they re-clever. We sat at the kitchen table. Pip was there, already halfway through a bowl of porridge. He looked back and forth between us, his eyes wide and curious. He could feel the tension. He could smell the change in the air. Miss Clara looks like she's fixin' to fight someone, Pip said, his spoon hovering in midair. I am, Pip, I said. I'm fighting a version of myself I don't want to be anymore. Pip nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Chu Silas, noisang sutatzom yung mutkan zao sak. Nó có thể làm bạn bị thương khi bạn lần đầu cầm lấy nó. Nhưng đó là thứ duy nhất có thể cắt bỏ những sợi dây đang trói buộc bạn. Cháu nghĩ rằng mọi người đều có quyền được biết sự thật về chính cuộc đời mình, ngay cả khi sự thật đó làm họ buồn. Bởi vì sống trong một lời nói dối cũng giống như sống trong một căn phòng không có cửa sổ. Bạn có thể, nhưng bạn sẽ không bao giờ biết mặt trời trông như thế nào. I reached out and ruffled the boydess hair. Your friend Silas is a very wise man. He says just old. Pip grinned. He says wisdom is what's left over after you've made every mistake you can possibly make. Gideon pushed his chair back. Well, I've made plenty of mistakes. Let's go see if we can avoid making any more today. We spent the afternoon in the high pasture. The air was getting colder. A front was moving in from the north. We worked in a rhythm that didn't require words. We were pulling old, rusted wire and replacing it with new galvanized strands. It was hard, finger-pinching work, but I found myself thinking about what Gideon said. The right to be the architect of your own purpose. For 3 years, my purpose had been Waidow. Before that, it was wife, and for the last 12 months, it was legal representative. I'd always been a title, a function. I'd never just been Clara. I looked at my hands. They were stained with rust and grease. My nails were broken. I looked at Gideon. He was bracing a post with his shoulder, his face set in concentration. He wasn't using me. He hadn't asked for my signature. He hadn't pressured me to stay or pressured me to go. He'd given me a shovel and a choice. And that was the most radical thing anyone had ever done for me. Around sunset, we sat on the ridge overlooking the creek. The water was a ribbon of molten copper in the fading light. Gideon, I said. Yeah. Why didn't you tell me on the first day? Why didn't you say, Clara, you're a Calloway, and you're the only one who can sign this land away? He looked at the water. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair. Because then you would have signed it out of obligation. Or you would have run away out of fear. Either way, you wouldn't have known the land. And you wouldn't have known me. He turned to look at me. I believe in the right of every person to come to their own truth in their own time, Clara. You can T-force a person to be ready for the light. You just have to leave the door open. If I'd told you, I would have been just like Hargrove, using the truth to get what I wanted. I wanted you to see this place for what it is, and I wanted to see me for who I am, because a human being has a right to be judged on their present actions, not on the history they were born into. We aren't just shadows of our ancestors. We are new things. Every morning is a chance to be a new thing. I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye. I brushed it away. I don't think I can go back to Denver, I whispered. The 21 days aren't up yet, he said. Don't make a decision while your heart is still loud. Wait for the quiet. We walked back to the house in the dark. The stars were coming out, thousands of tiny, bright pinpricks in a velvet sky. I felt small, but I didn't feel insignificant. I went to my cabin and picked up the ledger. I looked at the telegram one last time. Then I walked to the small, wood-burning stove in the corner. I opened the door and tossed the paper onto the glowing embers. I watched it curl. I watched the ink vanish. I watched the name Calloway turn to ash. It was a small act, but it was mine. Every person has the right to burn the bridges they didn't build, I said to the empty room. And every person has the right to build a new one stone at a time, to a place they actually want to go. I sat on the cot and listened to the wind. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a contract. I didn't have a title. I just had tomorrow. And as I closed my eyes, I realized that tomorrow was more than enough. It was a wide, open country, and I was finally starting to learn how to ride. The rain didn't just fall. It took over. It turned the yard into a soup of red clay and drowned out the sound of the cattle. I stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the water run off the eaves in silver sheets. My hands were deep in my pockets. They felt heavy. Clara was in the guest cabin. I could see the smoke from her stove. She'd burned that paper last night. I hadn't been watching from the window, not exactly, but I'd just seen the orange glow of the stove door opening and closing. I knew the look on S face when they were done being a puppet. I walked to the back of the barn, past the haymow, past the stalls. There was a loose board under the tack trunk. I knelt down. My knees popped a sound like dry kindling. I pulled up the board and reached into the dark. I pulled out a small, dented tin box. It had been my father, S. Jonas Vance. He was a man made of iron and pride, and not much else. He'd died in 1860, right before the world went to war with itself. He'd left me this land, and he'd left me the rot underneath it. I walked through the mud to the house. Clara was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with Pip. The boy was trying to teach her how to tie a slipknot with a piece of twine. I need to show you something, I said. I set the box on the table. It made a dull, heavy thud. Pip looked at the box, then at me. His eyes were wide. Is that treasure, true Gideon? No, Pip, I said, dead. The kind you can pay back with coins. I sat down. I opened the box. Inside was a single envelope. The paper was yellowed, the edges brittle as a dead leaf. I pushed it toward Clara. Read it, I said. Out loud. Pip needs to hear this too. He says going to be a man soon enough, and a man needs to know how a legacy is built and how it is broken. Clara took the letter. Her fingers were steady now. She cleared her throat. To my son Gideon, she began, if you are reading this, I am in the ground. I hope the grass is green over me, though I doubt I've earned the shade. I need to tell you about the sterling land, the Callaway Acres. In '58, I wanted the water rights. Edward Callaway wouldn't sell. I used a surveyor I'd paid off. I shifted the markers 200 yards east. I took the spring. I took his livelihood. I did it legal, with a stamp and a signature. But I did it wrong. I killed that man as spirit to grow my own herd. I hope you are a better man than I was. Give it back if you can. But I know you won't. Pride is a terminal disease. Your father, Jonas. The room went quiet. The only sound was the rain hammering on the tin roof. Pip looked at the letter, then at Clara. Then he looked at me. Is that why everyone calls you a monster? Chew Gideon, because of what your daddy did. I looked at the boy. Pip, you listen to me, I said. My voice was low, but I wanted it to carry weight. A person has an inherent right to the truth of their own history. You can't build a life on a foundation of lies and expect the roof not to leak. My father thought he had a right to that land because he was strong enough to take it. But he was wrong. No human being has a right to prosperity that is built on the deliberate suffering of another. That isn't success. That's theft dressed up in a suit. I've spent 7 years on this ranch, feeling like a squatter in my own home because I knew the foundation was poisoned. Clara was staring at the letter. She looked like she was seeing her father's face in the ink. He died in a rented room, Gideon. He'd thought he was a failure. He thought he just didn't work hard enough. And that the second crime? I said, looking at her. Every human being has a right to their own dignity. When someone steals from you through trickery, they aren't just taking your property. They are stealing your sense of worth. They make you believe that your struggle is your own fault. My father didn't just take your family's dirt, Clara. He took your father's peace of mind. And I am sitting here, 42 years old, realizing that I've been an accomplice to that theft by staying silent. Clara touched the edge of the paper. Is this why you made the 21-day rule? You were waiting for me? I was waiting for it to Sterling. I didn't know it would be you. I didn't know it would be a woman who looked like she'd been carrying the same weight I was. I leaned back in my chair. The wood groaned. Clara, we have to talk about the right to make amends, I said. A person shouldn't be trapped by the sins of their ancestors. We have a right to break the chain. But you can't break it by just feeling sorry. You have to act. Amending a wrong is a fundamental human responsibility. It's how we keep the world from becoming a place where only the predators survive. I didn't tell you the first day because I wanted you to see the land first. I wanted you to know what was stolen. Not just the acres, but the soul of the place. Pip reached out and touched the tin box. So, is Miss Clara going to take the land now? Is she going to kick us out? I looked at Clara. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I'd spent 7 years alone, and in 12 days, she'd made the house feel like a home. If she took the land, she had every right to it. She could sell it to Hargrove. She could walk away with a fortune. Clara looked at Pip. She smiled, but it was a sad kind of smile. Pip, she said. Her voice was rhythmic, like she was reciting a law of nature. Every person has a right to restitution, to have what was taken from them returned. That is a basic pillar of justice. If someone steals your horse, you have a right to your horse back. But there is also a right to choose your own future. Just because I have a right to this land doesn't mean I have to use it to hurt the people who are living on it now. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about balance. It's about making things right so that everyone can finally breathe. She looked at me. I don't want to be the reason you lose your home, Gideon. But I also don't want to be a tool for Hargrove. And you shouldn't be, I said. You have a right to your own agency. You aren't a key to open a lock for a corporation. You are a woman who just found out her father wasn't a failure. That is a legacy worth more than $4,200. You have a right to be the one who decides how story ends. Not me, not your father, and certainly not Hargrove. Clara stood up. She walked to the window and watched the rain. I spent my whole life thinking the law was the highest truth. I thought if a paper had a stamp, it was right. The law is just a map, Clara, I told her. But the map isn't the territory. A map can be drawn by a liar. The truth is the ground under your feet. And the ground says that this land was built on a lie. We have a right to draw a new map. A map where the boundaries are based on respect and honesty, not on who has the best lawyer or the slickest surveyor. Pip looked back and forth between us. Does this mean we a team now? Like in the stories Silas tells? Maybe, Pip, I said. But teams have to trust each other, and trust is a right that is earned through transparency. No more secrets. Not from me, not from Clara. I stood up and walked to the stove. I put the kettle on. My back felt a little lighter. Not much, but a little. Hargrove will come, Clara said. Her back was still to me. When I don't send the deed. When the 21 days are up, he'll come with his own version of the law. Let him come, I said. A human being has a fundamental right to defend their home and their truth. We aren't hiding anymore. We have the letter, we have the history, and most importantly, we have each other S-word. A man S-word is his bond, but a shared truth is a fortress. We stand our ground, not just for the acres, but for the right to live without looking over our shoulders. Clara turned around. Her eyes were bright. She looked fierce. I want to see the markers, Gideon, the ones your father moved. We'll go tomorrow, I promised, rain or shine. We'll find the old stones. We'll see exactly where the lie started. Pip hopped down from his chair. I'll help. Shazoi Team Dalam. I looked at the boy, then at the widow from Denver. We were a strange collection of broken pieces. A giant with a guilty conscience. A woman with a stolen past. An orphan with a pocket full of pecans. But as I sat back down and watched the rain turn to a light drizzle, I realized something. You know, I said, the rhythm of my speech slowing down to match the dripping eaves. People think a monster is something that hides in the dark. But the real monsters are the secrets we keep to protect our pride. Once you bring them into the light, they lose their teeth. Every person has a right to be free from the monsters of their past. And I think, for the first time in my life, I might finally be getting free. Clara sat back down. She reached out and touched my hand. Her skin was warm. It was the first time she touched me on purpose. We were getting free together, Gideon, she whispered. I didn't pull away. I didn't flinch. I just sat there, a giant man in a quiet house, listening to the world start to breathe again. We still had 15 days left on our deal, but the deals had changed. It wasn't about a sale anymore. It was about a reckoning. And as the sun peeked through the gray clouds for one final moment before dark, I knew that the reckoning was going to be the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The morning didn't just rise. It announced itself with a sharp biting cold that smelled of wet cedar, and the storm had moved east, leaving the sky a bright, merciless blue. It was the kind of day where you could see for 50 miles, but you felt every one of them in your marrow. Gideon was already saddling the horses when I stepped out. He didn't look up, but I saw the way his shoulders shifted. He knew I was there. He always knew. Pip was sitting on the porch steps, his chin resting in his hands. He looked small against the vastness of the Texas morning. He had a look of social importance on his face, like a soldier preparing for a long march. "We were going to the east line," Gideon said. He cinched the girth on the bay horse. The leather groaned. "That S where the spring starts. That S where the stones were moved." I climbed into the saddle. My muscles were sore. A dull ache that had become a familiar companion over the last 2 weeks. But today, the ache felt different. It felt like purpose. We rode in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of leather and the steady thud of hooves on the damp earth. We passed the wind tree, its silver bellies still damp from the rain. We passed the gullies that Pip called the memory part of the land. Finally, we reached the east boundary. The land here sloped down toward a deep rocky ravine. At the bottom, a spring bubbled out from the limestone, a clear, cold ribbon of life that fed the entire valley. Gideon dismounted. He led us to a pile of gray rocks near the edge of the slope. He knelt down and began to clear away the dead leaves and the tangled briars. "Here," he said. I looked down. There was a flat stone, half buried in the silt. It had a notched mark carved into its face, a surveyor S mark. But beside it, there was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, a line where the stone had clearly been dragged from its original resting place. Gideon looked up at me. "Clara, you need to understand the right to an honest history," he said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Every human being has a fundamental right to the truth of their own origins. When a man moves a marker, he isn't just shifting dirt. He is stealing the map of someone else's life. He is denying them the right to know where they stand in the world. My father thought he was just winning a game of inches. But a lie in the past grows into a mountain in the present. If we don't have an honest record of our beginnings, we can never have a just vision of our future. I knelt beside him. I touched the stone. It was cold, indifferent to the decades of suffering it had caused. "My father looked for this," I whispered. "He told the judge the spring was his. He said the map was wrong. And the judge believed the stone, not the man," Gideon said. "That is why the right to transparency is a basic human protection. When the systems of law, the maps and the deeds are used to hide the truth, rather than reveal it, they become weapons of the strong against the weak. A society is only as healthy as its records. If the truth is buried, the people will eventually be buried under it too. Your father wasn't crazy, Clara. He was just the only one who remembered the world before it was lied about." Pip walked over and looked at the jagged scar in the dirt. He reached out and touched the notch in the stone. "Can we move it back, True Gideon?" he asked. Gideon looked at me. The question hung in the air, heavier than the limestone. "Restitution is a right," Gideon said, looking directly at me. "When a wrong is discovered, the victim has a right to have the balance restored. That is the only way a community can heal. If we just say, 'I'm sorry, but keep the stolen spring,' then the apology is just another lie. True reconciliation requires the return of what was taken. Clara, this stone belongs 200 yards that way, and with it, the water, the valley, and the future of this ranch." I stood up. I looked across the ravine. I saw the lush grass near the water. I saw the potential of the land my father had died grieving for. If we move it, I said, my voice barely a whisper, Hargrove wins. He take the deed. He take the land from you. He'll turn this place into a factory for beef and profit, and he'll do it using my name. And that is where the right to agency becomes the most important right of all, Gideon said. He stood up, towering over me. Hargrove thinks property is just about possession, but property is a social contract. It's an agreement between neighbors to respect each other's space so that everyone can thrive. You have the right to restitution, Clara, but you also have the right to choose the form that restitution takes. You aren't a victim who has to take what S offered. You are an owner who can decide what's fair. You have a right to refuse a win that feels like a loss. I looked at the giant man standing in front of me. He was offering to give up everything he had worked for years to build. He was offering to be homeless so that I could be right. I don't want the spring if it means you lose the house, Gideon, I said. It is not about what you want, Clara, he said. It is about the right to a clean conscience. A person has a right to live without the shadow of a lie over their head. I've lived in that shadow for 7 years. I'm tired of it. I would rather be a man with nothing but the truth than a man with 400 acres of stolen water. We have to move the stone. Not for Hargrove, for us. We spent the next 3 hours working. It was the hardest labor I had ever done. We used a pry bar and a series of logs to roll the massive limestone block back up the slope. Every inch was a struggle. Every foot was a reckoning. Pip helped where he could, clearing stones and shouting encouragement. He looked like he was witnessing a miracle. In his world, things that were broken stayed broken. People who were gone stayed gone. But here, the world was being put back together. Finally, we reached the original site. There was an old, weathered hole in the ground, a perfect fit for the base of the stone. We rolled it in. It settled with a deep, final thud. The spring was now officially on the other side of the line. I sat on the grass, gasping for air. My hands were bleeding. My coat was ruined. But as I looked at that stone, sitting in its rightful place, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even known I was carrying. Do you feel that, Pip? Gideon asked, wiping sweat from his brow. That's what it feels like when the truth finally has a place to sit down. Every person has a right to a world that makes sense. When we lie, we make the world a puzzle with missing pieces. When we tell the truth, we give everyone the right to see the whole picture. It might be a hard picture to look at, but at least it is real. Pip nodded solemnly. Chu Silas noisang su tadzong như mặt trời. Đôi khi nó quá nóng và làm bạn đau, nhưng nếu không có nó, mọi thứ sẽ thối rữa trong bóng tối. Trong ý chú Silas sẽ thích hòn đá này. Chú ấy nói rằng công lý không phải là về việc ai thắng, mà là về việc mọi thứ trở lại đúng vị trí của chúng. Mà con người đều có quyền được sống trong thế giới công bằng. Ngay cả khi sự công bằng đó có nghĩa là chúng ta có ít đi một chút. We rode back to the house as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. The shadows were long, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. They felt like a blanket. As we reached the corral, a cloud of dust appeared on the west road. A black carriage was approaching. It was moving fast, the horses lording over the quiet land. Hargrove, I said. My heart skipped a beat. The 21 days weren't up. Not quite. But he wasn't a man who waited for deadlines if he thought he could seize an advantage. Gideon looked at the carriage. Then he looked at me. He didn't look afraid. He looked ready. Clara, remember your rights, he said. You have a right to legal counsel, yes. But more importantly, you have a right to your own moral compass. A lawyer can tell you what is legal, but only you can decide what is right. Don't let him use his fancy words to make you feel small. You are the one who moved the stone. You are the one who knows where the truth lives. Yes, just a man with a checkbook and a loud voice. A person's worth is not found in their bank account, but in their capacity to stand for the truth when it costs them something. I straightened my back. I brushed the red clay from my sleeves. I felt the weight of the letter in my pocket. I am ready, I said. The carriage pulled into the yard. Mr. Hargrove stepped out. He was dressed in a fine black wool suit. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He looked at the mud on the ground with a look of profound disgust. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was like oil on water. "I trust you've completed your evaluation. You're a few days early, but I thought I'd save you the trip back to Denver. I have the final deed right here." He pulled a fountain pen from his pocket. He held it out like a scepter. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at Gideon, standing like a mountain behind me. Then I looked at Pip, who was standing on the porch, watching us with the eyes of a boy who had just learned that the world could be fixed. "Mr. Hargrove," I said. My voice was calm. It was rhythmic. It sounded like the wind through the cedar trees. "A contract is an agreement between equals based on full disclosure. Since you withheld the truth about my lineage and the legal necessity of my signature, you have violated my right to an informed choice. Therefore, the original assignment is null and void. A human being is not a commodity to be traded in secret. We are partners in the truth, or we are nothing at all." Hargrove's face turned the color of a sunset. "Now see here, Clara, and furthermore," I continued, stepping forward, "we have found the original markers. The spring has been restored to its rightful place. Since Gideon Vance has occupied this land in good faith for years, and since the theft was committed by a previous generation, we are currently negotiating a partner based on reconciliation and acquisition. Every person has a right to their home, and every person has a right to decide who they do business with. And we have decided that we don't do business with liars." Hargrove looked at Gideon. He saw the size of him. He saw the look in his eyes. He saw the limestone dust on his clothes. He didn't say a word. He got back into his carriage. He signaled the driver. As the carriage sped away, leaving a trail of dust in the cold air, I felt a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Clara," Gideon said. "I just stood up for what's right, Gideon," I said. "Every person has that right. Most people just forget they have it until someone reminds them." Pip ran down from the porch and hugged my waist. "Ba zoitate Clara, badalam, chue sache matio." I laughed. It was a clear, bright sound that echoed off the ridges. "We still have 5 days left on our deal, Mr. Vance," I said, looking up at the giant. Gideon Mimkui. It was a small movement, but it melted the frost on his face. "I think the deal is done, Clara. But a person always has the right to stay, as long as they like. This land has a way of keeping the people who understand it." I looked out of the valley. The spring was flowing. The stone was set. The lie was gone. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I wasn't a widow. I wasn't a lawyer. I was just a person, and that was more than enough. The morning after Hargrove's carriage rattled out of the yard was the quietest I'd ever known it was, the heavy, suffocating quiet of a tomb. It was the quiet of a room after the windows had been thrown wide. Dust had settled. The air felt new. I stood on the porch, watching the sun drag itself over the horizon. The light was pale gold, catching the frost on the pump handle. I had 3 days left. 3 days until the 21-day mark. Most men would have been celebrating. We'd faced down a predator. We'd moved the stone. The truth was sitting pretty in the dirt for all the world to see. But as I watched the smoke rise into the guest cabin, I felt a familiar, cold dread settling in my belly. I'd spent years being the monster. It was a lonely life, sure, but it was a predictable one. Now the walls were down. The secrets were gone. And I realized that the hardest part of the truth isn't finding it. It's living with what comes after. I walked to the barn and grabbed my tool bag. The porch on the cabin had a soft spot, a board that groaned every time Claircox stepped on it. I'd noticed it on day 3, but I hadn't fixed it. Maybe because I wanted to hear her coming. Maybe because I didn't want to admit I cared if she tripped. I knelt down on the damp wood and started to pry up the old cedar. "You're working early," a voice said. I didn't turn around. I knew the rhythm of her boots. Clara was standing behind me, her coat buttoned tight against the morning chill. "A porch is a promise," I said, my voice rough. "It's the bridge between the world and the home. If it ain't solid, a person don't feel like they truly belong anywhere." I figured it was time this one kept its word. I pulled the rusted nails. They screeched, protesting the light. "Clara, you need to hear this," I said, pausing with the hammer in my hand. "Every human being has a fundamental right to self-determination. That means they have the right to choose their own path, without being tethered by the guilt or the needs of others. For the last 2 weeks, your path was tied to this land and to my father's sins. But the stone is moved now. The debt is acknowledged. You are a free woman. And being free means you have the right to leave Bitterroot Creek behind and never look. Just because I've grown used to the sound of your boots doesn't give me the right to keep you here. A person is not an ornament for someone else's life. They are the captains of their own soul." Clara sat down on the steps, her knees tucked under her chin. She watched me work for a long minute. "Hargrove will be looking for me in Denver," she said quietly. "He'll have questions. He'll have threats. And you have a right to face them or ignore them," I replied. "That is the beauty of being the architect of your own life. You don't owe that man a single explanation. There is a basic human right to privacy and peace. When someone tries to bully you into a corner, using their status or their money, they are violating your right to live without fear. You've done more for this land in 3 weeks than Hargrove has done in his whole life. You've earned your peace, Clara. Whether you find it here or in a city full of stone buildings, that's a choice only you get to make." I hammered in the first new board. The sound echoed off the ridges, sharp and final. "Why are you pushing me away, Gideon?" she asked. I stopped. I looked at my hands. They were scarred, stained with old oil and new dirt. "I'm not pushing, Clara. I'm letting go," I said, looking her square in the eyes. True love, the kind that matters, isn't about possession. It's about respect. It's about recognizing that the other person is a whole human being with their own dreams and their own right to seek happiness wherever it grows best. If I tried to hold you here because I'm as afraid of the quiet, I'd be no better than my father taking that spring. I'd be stealing your future to feed my own heart. I won't do that. You have a right to a life that fits you, not a life that just happens to fit me." She looked away, toward the creek. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She was a sterling. They were made of sterner stuff. Around noon, Pip showed up. He wasn't running today. He was walking slow, his hands tucked into his pockets. He sat on the watering trough, watching me sharpen a crosscut saw. "Chusilas says the wind is changing," Pip said. "He says the north wind is coming in to stay." I looked at the boy. "That's us winter talk, Pip." "He says winter is just the earth taking a breath," Pip replied. He looked at the guest cabin and then back at me. "Chu Gideon, mọi người đều có quyền được thuộc về một nơi nào đó. đúng không ạ? Chú Silas nói rằng một con người mà không có một nơi để gọi là nhà thì giống như một chiếc lá trong cơn bão. Cháu đã nghĩ về điều đó rất nhiều. Cháu không có cha mẹ, nhưng cháu có chú Silas, và bây giờ cháu cả cô Clara nữa. Cháu nghĩ rằng quyền được có một gia đình không phải lúc nào cũng là về dòng máu. Đó là về việc ai là người sẽ đi tìm bạn khi bạn bị lạc. Cô Clara có thuộc về nơi này không chú? I stopped the saw. The metal sang a low, mournful note. Pip, belonging is a choice, not a law, I said. Every child has a right to feel safe and wanted. That is a basic human necessity. But you can T-force a person to belong. It's like trying to make a wild bird stay in an open hand. You can provide the food and the shelter. But the bird has to decide if the hand is a home or a trap. Clara has the right to decide where her heart can breathe best. We have to respect that, because if we don't respect her choice, we aren't her family. We be just her jailers. Pip kicked his heels against the trough. Cháu hiểu rồi. Vậy nên chú mới đang sửa cái hiên nhà đó. Để nếu cô ấy đi, cô ấy sẽ đi trên những tấm ván chắc chắn. Và nếu cô ấy ở lại, cô ấy sẽ không bao giờ phải sợ bị vấp ngã. Chú đang cho cô ấy một lối thoát để cô ấy có thể thực sự chọn ở lại. I looked at that boy. He saw right through the armor I dispensed Sao years building. You're a sharp one, Pip. Go see if Clara needs help with the midday meal. The afternoon turned gray. The north wind, Silas promised, started to moan through the eaves. I went to my bedroom, a place I never let anyone enter. It was a sparse room, a bed, a washstand, and a heavy oak chest. I opened the chest. Deep at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of blue silk, was a locket. I found it years ago when I was digging the first well near the east line. It was made of dull gold, engraved with the initials MES, Margaret Eleanor Sterling. Smother. I'd kept it because I didn't know who it belonged to. Then I'd kept it because I was ashamed of how I'd come by the land it was buried in. I walked to the guest cabin. Clara was sitting by the stove, reading a book. She looked up as I entered. I didn't say a word. I just walked over and placed the blue silk bundle on the table. She unwrapped it. The locket caught the lamplight. Clara's breath hitched. She touched the gold with a trembling finger. She opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded tintype of a man with a kind face and a woman with Clara's eyes. My parents, she whispered. This was lost in the move. My mother cried for a year. I found it in the dirt of the east pasture, I said, and I kept it far too long. Clara, you have a right to your own heritage. A person's history is their property, their emotional property. When we withhold the physical pieces of a person's past, we are stealing a part of their identity. This locket doesn't belong to the Vance Ranch. It belongs to you. It is a piece of the mother you lost and the father who loved this land. Taking it back is your right, and I am sorry I waited until the 19th day to give it to you. She looked up at me, the tears finally spilling over. You kept it safe, Gideon. Safety is a right, too, I said, but it's a poor substitute for the truth. I wanted to give you something that was yours, truly yours, before you made your decision. I didn't want you to stay because you felt sorry for a lonely giant. And I didn't want you to leave because you thought this land held nothing for you but shadows. This locket is a reminder that your family as love is still here. In the soil, in the wind. It's part of the architecture of this place. Whether you stay or go, you take that love with you. I turned to leave, but she stood up and caught my arm. Her grip was strong. Stay for a minute, she said. I sat. We sat in the quiet of the cabin for a long time. The wind rattled the window panes. The stove hummed. I spent 3 years being a widow, she said. It was like a costume I put on, so I wouldn't have to be a person. I thought if I followed the rules and processed the papers, I wouldn't have to feel the emptiness. We all use labels as shields. Clara, I said. The town calls me a monster. You called yourself a widow. But labels are a violation of the right to be seen as a complex individual. When we reduce a human being to a single word, we are denying the depth of their soul. We are saying that their whole life can be summed up by one tragedy or one mistake. But you are more than a widow, and I am more than a giant. We have right to be understood in our entirety, with all our contradictions and our hidden hopes. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I froze for a second, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then, slowly, I relaxed. I felt the weight of her, the reality of her. I don't know if I can go back to Denver and pretend that 47 pages are the whole truth, she whispered. Then don't, I said. You have the right to change your mind. You have the right to start over. A Person S life isn't a straight line, Clara. It's a trail. Sometimes the trail washes out. Sometimes it leads to a cliff. And when that happens, you have every right to turn around and find a new way home. We stayed like that until the fire in the stove burned low. I left her there with her mother S. Lockett and her father S. Legacy. I walked back to my house, the wind biting at my face. The 21 days were almost up. I'd given her the choice. I'd fixed the porch. ID returned the locket. ID told her she was free. And as I lay in my sparse room, listening to the north wind, I realized that I had finally learned the hardest lesson of all. Freedom is the highest right of the human spirit, I whispered in the dark. But the right to be loved, that as the one that makes the freedom worth having. I closed my eyes, wondering if day 22 would bring the sound of a carriage leaving, or the sound of a new porch board holding firm under the weight of a woman who had finally decided where she belonged. The sky didn't turn a gray. It turned a bruised, sickly green. It was the 19th day. The air had gone dead still, no birds, no wind, just a heavy, suffocating heat that made the back of my neck prickle. Gideon was out in the north pasture, checking the cattle. He'd seen the blue norther coming before the first cloud even peeked over the horizon. I was in the kitchen, packing a small tin of biscuits when the first clap of thunder bit. It was toot, a rumble. It was a crack, like the earth itself was splitting open. Then came the rain. It didn't fall in drops. It fell in sheets. Within minutes, the yard was a river of red mud. The creek, the one that had been a gentle ribbon of copper just yesterday, was starting to roar. It was a sound I never forget. A low, vibrating growl that you felt in your teeth. I looked out the window, searching for Gideon, but I didn't see him. I saw something else. I saw Pip S. hat. It was caught on a bramble bush near the edge of the ravine, the memory part of the land, the place where the flash floods always hit the hardest. My heart didn't just beat, it hammered. Pip. He'd gone out an hour ago to look for wild pecans. He didn't know how fast the water moved in Texas. He was a boy from the church steps, used to stone and pavement. I ran out the door. The wind nearly knocked me flat. I screamed his name, but the storm swallowed it whole. Then, shape merged from the gray. Gideon. He was on his big black horse, riding hard. He saw me pointing. He saw the hat. He didn't stop to ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He swung the horse toward the ravine, pushing the animal through mud that was already knee-deep. I ran after them, slipping, falling, my lungs burning in the cold air. When I reached the edge of the ravine, I stopped. The water was a churning, chocolate-brown monster. It was carrying branches, fence posts, and rocks. And there, caught on a crumbling ledge of limestone halfway down the bank, was Pip. He was clinging to a cedar root. His face was white. He wasn't crying. He was past crying. He was just hanging on. Gideon, I shrieked. Gideon was already off his horse. He didn't have a rope. There wasn't time to go back to the barn. The ledge was dissolving under the boy. Gideon looked at me, just for a second. His eyes were calm. In the middle of the chaos, he was the only thing that made sense. "Clara, listen to me," he shouted over the roar of the flood. "Every human being has an inherent right to be rescued. It doesn't matter if they were foolish. It doesn't matter if they went where they shouldn't. The right to life and safety is the most basic law of the universe. We don't weigh a person's worth before we reach out a hand. We reach out because they are there, and because we can. That is the only measure of a man that counts." Then he stepped off the edge. He didn't fall. He descended. He used his massive strength to dig his boots into the crumbling clay. He was a giant against the storm. The water hit him, pulling at his waist, trying to suck him into the deep. But he held. He was an anchor in a world that had gone adrift. He reached the ledge. He wrapped one arm around the cedar root and used the other to scoop Pip up. He tucked the boy against his chest into that space where I had rested my head only the night before. He began to climb. It looked impossible. The earth was turning to liquid. Every time he took a step, the bank gave way. But he didn't stop. He used his fingers like claws, tearing his nails on the rock. He used his knees. He used his sheer, stubborn will. When he reached the top, he crawled onto the grass and collapsed. He was covered in mud. His shirt was torn to ribbons. His hands were bleeding. Pip was shaking, gasping for air. Gideon didn't let him go. He held the boy close, shielding him from the driving rain. We made it back to the house. I don't know how. It was a blur of wind and mud. Gideon sat on the floor by the stove. He didn't have the strength to get into a chair. I wrapped them both in heavy wool blankets. I stoked the fire until the iron glowed red. Pip finally stopped shaking. He pulled back a little, looking up at the man who had just pulled him from the mouth of death. Gideon's face was a mask of exhaustion and pain. The scars on his neck stood out, dark and jagged. Pip reached out. His small, trembling hand touched Gideon's cheek. "They said you were a monster," Pip whispered. His voice was small, but in the quiet of the kitchen, it sounded like a thunderclap. Gideon flinched. He started to pull away, his old habit of hiding his face coming back to him. He looked like he was waiting for the blow. He looked like he was waiting for the boy to see the beast that town had promised. But Pip didn't pull back. He leaned in. "They were wrong, Chew Gideon," Pip said. "Monsters don't hearts this warm, and monsters don't risk their lives for a boy who forgot to listen. Chew Silas nói đúng. Mọi con người đều có quyền được nhìn nhận của lòng tốt của chính mình, chứ không phải qua những bóng ma mà người khác gán cho họ. Chú là người hùng của cháu, và một người hùng không bao giờ có thể là một con quái vật." Gideon Tram froze. Then, the strangest thing happened. The giant cowboy, the man who had survived a war, a hanging rope, and 7 years of silence, began to tremble. A low, choked sound came from his throat. A sob. He leaned his forehead against Pip-Pip's small shoulder, and he wept. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was a release. It was the sound of 20 years of shame and loneliness finally breaking apart. He cried for the man he couldn't save in 71. He cried for the father who had lied to him. He cried for the monster he had tried so hard to be, so that people wouldn't see how much he was hurting. I sat on the floor beside them and put my arms around both of them. "You see, Gideon," I whispered, "a child's eyes are the only true lens we have left in this world. They have a right to the truth, and Pip just gave it back to you. You have a right to be loved, not for your perfection, but for your courage. You have a right to be forgiven. And most of all, you have a right to believe that you are a good man, because you are." We sat there for a long time. The storm continued to scream outside, but the kitchen was a sanctuary. Late that night, after Pip had fallen into a deep sleep in the spare bed, I sat at the kitchen tea table. My ledger was open. I looked at the final page, the deed for the Vance Ranch. I thought about Denver. I thought about Mr. Hargrove and the polished mahogany desks. I thought about the career I had built, the professional widow who followed the rules and never looked at the silver undersides of the leaves. I realized that if I sent this deed, I would be committing a crime, not a legal one, a moral one. Gideon, I said. He was sitting in the rocking chair, his hands bandaged, watching the fire. Yeah, Clara, a job is just a contract, I said, my voice rhythmic and steady. But a life is a commitment to the truth. We have a fundamental human right to work that aligns with our conscience. When our labor is used to destroy the things we love, we are violating our own souls. I realize today that I don't want to be a legal representative anymore. I want to be a person who helps things grow. I want to be someone who protects the anchors of the world, not someone who pulls them up for a profit. I picked up the fountain pen. I didn't sign the deed. Instead, I wrote a letter to Mr. Hargrove. It was short. It was punchy. It was the most honest thing I had ever written. The Bitterroot Ranch is not for sale. The markers have been restored. The lineage search you conducted was a violation of my rights as an employee and a human being. I hereby resign my position, effective immediately. Do not send another representative. They will find the gates locked and the truth standing guard. I folded the letter. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was better than any win in a courtroom. You're torching your bridges, Clara, Gideon said. He was watching me with a look of profound respect. Every person has a right to burn a bridge that only leads back to a cage, I replied. I spent 3 years walking across that bridge, thinking it was the only path I had. But I forgot that I have feet. I can walk on the grass. I can walk on the mud. I can choose a new direction. Razzing isn't losing a career, Gideon. It's gaining my agency back. It's us exercising my right to say no to a lie. Gideon stood up. He walked over to the table and looked at the letter. You know, he said, his voice deep and melodic. Labels are just cages for people we are too scared to love. The town called me a monster. Denver called you a lawyer. But tonight, we read just two people who saved a boy. And that is a right that no contract can ever take away. The right to be useful. The right to be real. He reached out and took my hand. His grip was bandaged and rough, but his touch was light. Tomorrow is day 20, he said. It is. And day 21? On day 21, I said it. I think we should go see the wind tree. I want to see if it's telling us that the storm is over. Gideon smiled. It was a real smile, a giant smile. The storm is never really over, Clara, he said, but we have a right to a house that can weather it. And I think why I finally finished building the foundation. I looked at the fire. I looked at the bandaged hands of the giant. I looked at the door behind which a little boy was breathing softly. The 19th day was ending. The monster was dead. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the quiet. I was living in it. I went to my cabin and slept the sleep of the free. I didn't dream of contracts. I didn't dream of Denver. I dreamed of red dirt, silver leaves, and a man who was big enough to hold the whole world together, but gentle enough to let a little boy lead him home. The Bitterroot Creek didn't look like a battlefield anymore. It looked like a garden. A year had passed since the Great Flood of '78. The summer of 1879 had arrived with a slow, honey-colored heat and the smell of ripening peaches. The red clay was still there, but it was covered in thick green grass. The scars on the ravine were fading under a blanket of wildflowers. Silas Thorne pulled his wagon to a stop at the front gate. He was 72 now. His bones were a little more brittle. His eyes were a little more cloudy, but he could still see what mattered. He didn't see a monster standing in the yard. He didn't see a city widow struggling with a shovel. He saw two people who had stopped fighting the world and started building a new one. Gideon Vance was at the barn. He was hoisting a massive cedar beam into place. He moved with that same deliberate power, but the tension was gone. The weight he was carrying now was made of wood and nails, not secrets and shame. Clara Sterling, though she had started to introduce herself, simply as Clara these days, was on the porch. She wasn't holding a ledger. She was holding a book. Pip was sitting at her feet, his brow furrowed in concentration as he traced the letters on the page. Silas climbed down from his wagon. He walked toward the porch, his cane thumping rhythmically against the hard-packed earth. "The wind tree is quiet today, Silas," Clara said, looking up with a smile. She looked younger. The sharp lines of Denver had been softened by the Texas sun. "That's because the earth is happy," Silas replied. He sat down on the steps. He looked at Pip. "What are you learning today, Caleb?" Pip looked up, his eyes bright. "We're learning about the right to a fair trial, Silas," the boy said. "Miss Clara says that every human being has a fundamental right to be heard before they are judged. She says that a judge who doesn't listen to the heart is just a man in a black robe, and that justice isn't about what's written in a book, but about what's true in the light of day." Clara closed the book. She looked at Silas. "I want him to know his rights, Silas," she said. "Not as a lawyer knows them, but as a free man knows them. I want him to understand that his voice has value simply because he exists. Every person has a right to their own perspective. When we silence a voice because it is small or because it is inconvenient, we are stealing a piece of the world's truth. I spent too many years helping men like Hargrove drown out the voices of the people they were stepping on. I won't let that happen to this boy." Silas nodded. He looked over at Gideon. The giant cowboy had finished with the beam and was walking toward them. He wiped his brow with a bandana. He looked at Silas, then at Clara. "The north fence is holding," Gideon said. "The cattle are fat. I reckon we have earned a rest." He sat on the edge of the porch. His massive frame occupied the space, but it didn't feel threatening. It felt like an anchor. "You know, Silas," Gideon said, his voice deep and rhythmic, "I used to think that property was just about who had the deed. I thought that owning land meant you had the right to do whatever you wanted with it. But I was wrong. Every human being has a right to be a steward, not just an owner. A steward understands that the land has rights, too. The water has a right to be clean. The trees have a right to grow. And the neighbors have a right to a man who keeps his word. Ownership is a responsibility to the future, not just a privilege in the present." Silas leaned back against the cedar post. "That's a hard lesson for most men to learn, Gideon. Most folks think rights are things you take. They don't realize that rights are things you give. You give your neighbor the right to be safe. You give the stranger the right to a cup of water. When you start giving rights, you find that you have more for yourself. That is the secret of a peaceful community. It is built on the right to mutual respect, which is the only currency that never loses its value." Clara reached out and took Gideon's hand. It was a natural movement, unhurried. "We signed the new deed this morning," she said to Silas. "A deed of partnership. It's a legal document, but it says something the old contracts never did. It says that this land belongs to the family that lives on it, and that no part of it can ever be sold without the consent of every person who calls it home. We've established a right to collective security. No one person can trade away the safety of the others. It is our way of saying that the home is a sacred space, and every person in it has an equal right to its protection. Pip looked at the two of them. Does that mean I am a partner too? Gideon ruffed the boy's hair. It means you have a right to a say in what happens here, Pip. Every child has a right to be included in the conversations that shape their future. We don't just tell you what to do. We show why it matters. Because a person who grows up without a voice never learns how to use it when they finally need to stand up for what is right. The sun began to dip behind the bitterroot ridges. The sky turned a deep royal purple, streaked with veins of orange and gold. It was a beautiful, quiet moment. They still call you a giant in town? Gideon, Silas said, a twinkle in his eye. I reckon I'll always be a giant, Gideon smiled. But they don't call you a monster, Clara added softly. Gideon looked at the boy sitting at his feet. He looked at the woman holding his hand. Look, he looked at the old man, who had been the witness to his reckoning. That 'cause we finally recognized the most important right of all, Gideon said. His voice was like a slow-moving river. The right to be seen for who we are in this moment, not for who we were in the dark. Every human being has a right to redemption. They have a right to wash off the mud of their past and stand up straight in the sun. When we refuse to forgive, we are violating a person's right to change. And if a man can change, then the world is just a prison. But we aren't in a prison. We're on a ranch, and the gates are wide open. Pip stood up and looked out at the horizon. Ju Silas, Ninkia, Lot K. Jordang Shay. They all looked. The gnarled oak tree was shimmering in the evening breeze. The leaves were turning, showing their silver bellies. Is it a storm? Pip asked, a hint of worry in his voice. Clara stood up and pulled the boy close. No, Pip, she said. The wind tree isn't just for storms. It's for the change of the season. It's telling us that the heat is breaking. It's telling us that the earth is preparing for the harvest. Every living thing has a right to its own season of rest. We've worked hard, we've told the truth, and now we have the right to sit here and watch the stars come out. Silas Thorne watched them as he prepared to leave. He saw the way the giant cowboy looked at the city lawyer. He saw the way the orphan boy felt safe in their shadow. He realized then that the story of Bitterroot Creek wasn't a story about sale. It wasn't even a story about a crime. It was a story about the restoration of human dignity. You know, Silas said, as he climbed back onto his wagon. People think the law is the highest power, but the law is just a shadow of the truth. The highest power is the right to love and be loved in return. It is the only right that can be taken away, because it is the only one we give to ourselves. You three have found that right, and as long as you hold on to it, no monster in this world can ever touch you. Silas signaled his horses. The wagon creaked away into the deepening twilight. Clara, Gideon, and Pip stood on the porch. The board didn't groan. It held firm. The silence of the Texas night settled over them, but it wasn't a lonely silence. It was the silence of a house that had finally learned how to breathe. I'm glad I stayed, Gideon, Clara whispered. I'm glad you stayed too, Clara, Gideon replied. Every person has a right to find where they belong. I am just thankful that you found it here. They watched as the first star appeared, a bright, steady point of light in the velvet sky. The monster was gone. The widow was gone. The orphan was gone. There was only a family, and they were exactly where they were meant to be. They had claimed their right to be happy. And in the vast, open country of Texas under the watchful eyes of the wind tree, that was the greatest victory of all.
As this story comes to an end, we are left with more than the dust of Bitterroot Creek, more than the memory of a lonely ranch, a wounded widow, a feared cowboy, and a child wise beyond his years. We are left with a truth that reaches far beyond the Texas frontier. No human being should ever be judged by rumors, by appearance, by the sins of their family, or by the name the world has forced upon them. Gideon Vance was called a monster because people were afraid to look deeper. Clara Sterling was treated like a tool because powerful men believed her value came from what she could sign, not from who she truly was. And yet, through hardship, honesty, and compassion, both of them discovered something sacred. Every person has the right to be seen clearly, to choose their own path, and to rebuild a life from the broken pieces of the past. The lesson of this story is that justice is not always loud and love is not always simple. Sometimes justice begins with one person telling the truth. Sometimes healing begins with returning what was stolen, even when it costs us something. And sometimes love begins not with grand promises, but with quiet acts of respect, fixing a porch so someone can leave safely, returning a family locket, protecting a helpless lamb, or giving another person the freedom to stay without pressure. Gideon and Clara teach us that real love does not trap, control, or possess. Real love gives room for choice. Real love honors the dignity of another soul. This story also reminds us that the past may shape us, but it does not have to own us. We may inherit pain, shame, grief, or silence, but we are not condemned to repeat the wrongs that came before us. Gideon could have hidden behind his father's sins, but he chose to make amends. Clara could have allowed bitterness to guide her, but she chose truth over revenge. Together, they showed that forgiveness does not mean forgetting injustice. It means having the courage to face it, correct it, and build something better from it. And perhaps the most beautiful message of all is this: family is not always born from blood. Sometimes family is found in the people who see your wounds and do not turn away. It is found in the hands that help you stand, the hearts that protect you when you are vulnerable, and the voices that remind you of your worth when the world has made you forget it. In Gideon, Clara, and Pip, we see that even the loneliest souls can find a place to belong when truth, kindness, and compassion are allowed to take root. So let this story stay with you as a reminder. Do not be too quick to believe the world's labels. Look deeper, listen longer, judge people by their actions, not by whispers. And when life gives you the chance to choose between pride and honesty, between fear and compassion, between revenge and healing, choose the path that lets your heart remain human. Because in the end, land, money, and reputation all fade with time, but the kindness we give, the truth we defend, and the love we leave behind are the things that truly endure.